We'll call this meeting of Lima City Council to order. We'll begin tonight's meeting with the invocation by Councilor Lowe, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance.
At this time, before we pray, I'd like to take a moment of silence for the young children who had to go through that terrible tragedy this week. With every eye closed and heads bowed, dear Lord, we thank you once again for the opportunity to do the business of the city. We ask that you work within us and through us, that we will make the best decisions for the city of Lima. We ask that you wrap your arms of protection upon every employee of the city, resident of this city, and our leader, our mayor. Dear Lord, we ask that you continue to touch us and bless us, that the city could be as prosperous as possible. In the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Call the roll.
Mr. Nieper.
Here.
Mr. McLean.
Here.
Mr. Lowe.
Here.
Mr. Tevin.
Here.
Ms. Adams.
Here.
Mr. Glenn.
Here.
Ms. Towns.
Here.
And Mr. Nixon.
Yes, I'm here. Are there any amendments to tonight's agenda?
Yes, Mr. President. I'd like to amend tonight's agenda to include the Safety Services Committee report and Ordinance 286-12.
Second. The motion, the second, is to amend tonight's agenda by adding the Safety Services Committee report and Ordinance 286-12. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries. Resolution 1912.
Expressing appreciation of the Lima City Council to the Spartan Boys U14 soccer team for winning the SAY State Tournament Championship.
Mr. President,
Mr. McLean.
I move that Resolution 1912 be passed on its first reading after being read.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass Resolution 1912 on its first reading after having been read. I'll have the clerk read the resolution.
Whereas 6 years ago, the Lima Youth Soccer Association developed a program so that the Lima City School middle school children had an opportunity to play soccer for their schools. And whereas in that 6 years, Lima Youth Soccer Association has sent 3 teams to the state tournament. And whereas this year, the Spartan Boys U14 soccer team, coached by Matt Burney, won the WCOSA division with a 9-1 record. And whereas the team continued the journey, winning 4 games in the state tournament to capture the SAY State Championship Tournament with a victory over St. Ursula Villa, Cincinnati, 8-1. Whereas this accomplishment represents the elements of discipline, dedication, determination, and teamwork represented in all championship teams. And whereas Coach Burney and the team members of the Spartan Boys U14 soccer team should be congratulated for their outstanding efforts and tremendous sportsmanship throughout the entire 2012 season. Now therefore be it resolved by the Council of the City of Lima, Ohio, that the Lima City Council, on behalf of the entire Lima community, extends sincere appreciation to the Spartan Boys U14 soccer team and Coach Burney for the honor and recognition that they have brought to our community.
Is there any discussion on the motion?
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn.
I want to congratulate all the kids and Coach Burney. I see what you're doing in your retirement, working with the kids, and it's super.
No, it's him, Derek.
Oh, the younger Burney, huh? Okay, well, I know Dad is involved too, but good job, Doug. I love seeing this when we're doing a good job in our community, and these kids are playing soccer, and soccer is our future. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Glenn. Is there any further discussion? I just want to say congratulations not only to the coach and to the players, but also to the parents. Soccer is one of those sports that you play regardless of the weather. You go and you watch your children regardless of the weather. And even though some would argue we had a fairly mild fall, it was not dry. It was not sunny and 70 every game, every practice. A lot of dedication, a lot of hard work, and congratulations to all the team members and to you, Coach Burney, and to the parents. I'll ask the clerk to call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes. Resolution 1912 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Coach Burney, I'll ask you to come forward and I'll present you the resolution.
Okay.
There's one of the rules.
Well, it's an honor for myself, a 94 graduate of Lima Senior High School, to come back and work with the kids. I've been with most of them for the better of 3 years on the soccer field, a few of them on the soccer field, on the basketball field, and on the baseball field. It's great, an honor for me to work with them. Just like to give back to my community as much as I can through helping the kids. And this year, you know, it kind of came together. We had some great talent on the field. We definitely had our struggles throughout the season, but as anything in life, you take those with a grain of salt, you stay positive, and you move forward. And we had a great run in the state tournament. Won our first couple games pretty big. Had a great test in the semifinal game. We won 3-2. And then we just really came out and were not to be denied and won that state championship 8-1. So proud to be a part of the community, proud to give back to the community, proud to work with our guys and bring home that state champion for Lima. So good job, guys.
Could you have your team members stand up so we can be recognized?
Everybody? And thank you.
Thank you.
For everything you guys have done. Have a good night.
Consent calendar.
Mr. President,
Ms. Townsend?
I move that items B, C, and D on the consent calendar be received and filed, and item A be received, filed, and approved.
Second. The motion and the second is that items B, C, and D of the consent calendar be received and filed, and that item A be received, filed, and approved. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 1.
From Chief Hefner requesting a waiver of Chapter 840.03B4.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn.
I move that communication number 1 received and filed and sent to the Safety Service Committee.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 1 and refer it to Council's Safety Services Committee. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. 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 Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 2.
From Chief Hefner regarding legislation to amend Section 234.181.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn.
I move that communication number 2 received and filed, legislation on the night agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 2. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 3.
From Chief Hefner regarding legislation to enter into a contract with All Chrysler Dodge.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn.
I move that communication number 3 receive and file, legislation on the night agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 3. Is there any discussion?
Mr. President?
Mr. Lowe.
Yes, at this time, I'd ask for the chief to come forward if he could briefly and explain the importance of the purchase of this car at $16,000 plus.
Mr. President, this purchase is a staff vehicle for Lima Fire Department. Between the chief, the fire prevention officers, the deputy chiefs, and the arson investigator, we do have a need for staff vehicles. We could use up to 8 staff vehicles. I currently have 5. This was just one that's going to replace the chief's vehicle, which we pushed down to be shared between fire prevention and the deputy chief's positions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 4.
From the mayor regarding merit increases.
Mr. President,
Ms. Townsend?
I move that communication number 4 be received and filed.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 4. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 5.
From the auditor regarding legislation to enter into a contract with MS Govern.
Mr. President. Mr. Tevin.
I move that communication number 5 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 5. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 6.
From the Director of Utilities requesting legislation to enter into a contract with Jones and Henry Engineers.
Mr. President,
Mr. McLean.
I move that communication number 6 be received and filed, and authorize the law director to prepare any necessary legislation.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 6 and to authorize the law director to prepare the necessary legislation. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 7.
From the Director of Community Development requesting legislation to place tax assessments for specified parcels.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I move that communication number 7 be received and filed. Legislation's on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 7. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 8.
From the Director of Utilities regarding legislation to accept the donation of 412, 416 North Central Avenue.
Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Mr. Geiger?
If I may, I apologize, Councilman McLean, we should change that from central to union.
Oh, yeah.
I move that we amend number 8 to, on the first paragraph, under 412, 416 North Central to North Union Street.
Second.
Second.
Motion and the second is to amend the communication to reflect North Union Street. Is there any discussion on that motion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Mr. McLean.
Mr. President, I move that communication number 8 be received and filed. Authorize the law director to prepare any necessary legislation.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 8 as amended and to authorize the law director to, well, he'll have to, I know, authorize the law director to prepare any necessary legislation, which has already been authorized.
Thank you.
It's on.
It is on. He's quit. That's because he's quit.
Who seconded?
Is there any discussion on that motion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 9.
From the Finance Director regarding legislation for an amendment to Ordinance 22212.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin.
I move that communication number 9 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 9. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 10.
From the Finance Director regarding legislation for 2013 temporary appropriations.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin.
I move that communication number 10 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 10. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 11.
From the Director of Public Works regarding legislation to enter into a contract with Benz Construction, Inc.
Mr. President,
Mr. Neal.
I move that communication number 11 be received and filed.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 11. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 12.
From the City Engineer regarding legislation to enter into a contract with Miller Cable Company.
Mr. President,
Mr. Nieper.
I move that communication number 12 be received and filed.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 12. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 13.
From the Director of Public Works requesting legislation to enter into a contract with Benz Construction.
Mr. President,
Mr. Nieper.
I move that communication number 13 be received and filed.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 13. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 14.
From the Finance Director regarding legislation for cash advances and transfers.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin.
I move that communication number 14 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 14. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 15.
From the Law Director regarding the number of ordinances for 2012.
Mr. President,
Ms. Townsend.
I move that communication number 15 be amended. In the first block, in the history chart, second column under ordinances, that first number be amended to 286.
Second.
And the same on under number 3 in the second block, for 2012, 286.
Second.
The motion, the second, is to amend communication number 15 to replace the number 285 with 286 on the Lima ordinance history chart. Is there any discussion on the motion to amend? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries. Ms. Townsend.
Mr. President, I move that communication number 15 be received and filed as amended.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 15 as amended. Is there any discussion? I just want to point out, for everybody who doesn't have a copy of this, it's just a point of information that in the calendar year 2012, Lima City Council acted upon 286 ordinances, which is the third highest number of ordinances since 1983. So it's been a busy year, but not as busy as 2009 and 2006. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Communication number 16.
From the Deputy Law Director regarding legislation for sale of property.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I move that communication 16 be received and filed.
Second.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 16. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion passes. Communication number 17.
From the Finance Director regarding legislation for year-end transfers and additional appropriations.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin.
I move that communication number 17 be received and filed. Legislation is on tonight's agenda.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive and file communication number 17. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Reports of committees. Safety Services Committee.
It's it's a three-page three-page report, and I'll give everyone an opportunity. If you'd like to see this, we can. All city council already looked at it already, but our agenda is pretty big tonight. I'm going to make a motion to move the committee report, receive and file, and approve it.
Second.
The motion and the second is to receive, file, and approve the committee report as submitted by Councilor Glenn. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Now ordinances. 24612.
This is a second reading, enter into contract with Clemens Nelson and Associates.
Mr. President,
Ms. Townsend?
I move that ordinance 24612 be amended to reflect in section 1, after the word appropriate, comma, not to exceed $25,000.
Second.
The motion and the second is to amend ordinance 24612 in section 1, line 3, after the word appropriate, insert a comma, and then the words not to exceed $25,000. Is there any discussion on the motion to amend? All those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Ms. Townsend.
Mr. President,
Ms. Townsend.
I move that ordinance 24612 be passed on its second reading.
Second.
As amended.
As amended.
Second.
Thank you.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 24612 on its second reading as amended. Is there any discussion? Under discussion, I'll make a motion to authorize the clerk and law director to submit a clean copy. Okay. That's my motion. Can I get a second? Thank you. Motion and the second to submit a clean copy. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. The motion on the ordinance is to pass it on its first reading as amended. I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Second reading as amended. Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Miss Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 24612 has been passed on its second reading as amended by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 25512.
This is the second reading, enacting Chapter 1690 to establish inspection fees for services of the Lima Fire Department completed pursuant to the Ohio Fire Code.
Mr. Glenn.
Oh, boy, Mr. President, I move that resolution, ordinance 25512 be adopted on its first reading.
Second.
Thank you.
Okay. The motion and the second, I assume you meant second reading.
Yes, second reading.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 25512 on its second reading. Is there any discussion?
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn?
I'd like to say a couple things about that. I appreciate Ms. Adams and Ms. McLean, Sam McLean, and all the rest of the council that came out and made sure that we got these fees together. And I didn't get to read it because it's pretty big right now, but I want to let you know that we are going to do inspection on homes free. Most of the inspection will be going to foster care, buildings, and it's going to change around a little bit, but if you need the fire department to come out and check your house, we're doing that free. So we made sure these fees good, but everyone came together and we made a good decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Glenn. Is there any further discussion?
Mr. President.
Mr. McLean?
Oh, that's
These new construction inspections for commercial buildings is what we're trying to inspect. We're trying to follow up with our actual permit department to make sure that the buildings are fire safety. And the fire department is the best people to do that. They have to have a team of people that do the sprinkler systems and make sure they're good. And it does go into the daycares and nurseries and things like that for inspection, but I think I would love to have the place that I drop my kid off every day inspected and know that it wasn't a fire hazard. So we worked through this, and it's not just for a 1 or 2 family house. It's not what it's designed for. This is more on the commercial side. So thank the chief for informing everybody and getting us the right information. We appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. McLean. Is there any further discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Miss Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Ordinance 25512 has been passed on its second reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 25812.
Levying special assessments for property maintenance code charges on premises in the city of Lima, Ohio.
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
I move that ordinance 25812 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 25812 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Miss Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Ordinance 25812 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 25912.
Levying special assessments for property maintenance code charges on premises in the city of Lima, Ohio.
Mr. President,
Mr.
I
Glenn.
move that ordinance, resolution 25912 be adopted on the first reading.
Second.
Motion and second is to pass ordinance 25912 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Miss Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Ordinance 25912 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 26012.
Authorizing payment from the Lima Municipal Court Computer and Special Projects Funds.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin.
I move that ordinance 26012 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 26012 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 26012 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 26112.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into an agreement with the Standard Life Insurance Company.
Mr. President,
Ms. Townsend?
I move that ordinance 26112 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 26112 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 26112 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 26212.
Authorizing the auditor to make payment to the State of Ohio Environmental Protection Agency.
Mr. President,
Mr. McLean?
I move that ordinance 26212 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 26212 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 26212 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 26312.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with Marimore Industries, Inc.
Mr. President,
Mr. Nieper.
I move that ordinance number 26312 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 26312 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 26312 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 26412.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into 2 contracts with custom staffing.
Mr. President,
Mr. Nieper.
I move that ordinance number 26412 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 26412 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
No.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
No.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 26412 has been passed on its first reading by a 6-2 vote. Ordinance 26512.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into 2 contracts with Spirion, Inc.
Mr. President,
Mr. Nieper.
I move that ordinance number 26512 be amended in several locations. First, in the caption, it should be enter into 1 contract, not 2. In the first paragraph, the first whereas, 2 contracts needs to be changed to 1 contract, and we need to delete the words "and plans examiner." In section 1, we need to again eliminate the number 2, or change the number 2 to the number 1, and delete the words "and plans examiner" in the 3rd line.
Second.
The motion and the second is to amend ordinance 26512 with the corrections as stated by Councilor Nieper. Is there any discussion on the amendment? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Mr. Nieper.
Mr. President, I move that we pass ordinance number 26512 on its first reading and authorize the law director to provide the clerk a clean copy.
Second.
As amended. And authorized.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 26512 on its first reading as amended and to authorize the clerk and law director to submit a clean copy. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
No.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
No.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 26512 has been passed on its first reading as amended by a 6-2 vote. Ordinance 26612.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with JP Management Group, Inc.
Mr. President,
Mr.
I
Nieper.
move that ordinance number 26612 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 26612 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon,
Yes.
Mr. Nieper,
Yes.
and Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 26612 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 26712.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with James A. Stedke for administrative inspection services.
Mr. President,
Mr. Nieper.
I move that ordinance number 26712 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 26712 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe,
Yes.
Mr. Tevin.
Yes.
Ms. Adams.
Yes.
Mr. Glenn.
Yes.
Ms. Townsend.
Yes.
Mr. Nixon.
Yes.
Mr. Nieper,
Yes.
and Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 26712 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 26812.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with Richard Cottrell for building inspection services.
Mr. President,
Mr. Nieper.
I move that ordinance number 26812 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 26812 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe,
Yes.
Mr. Tevin.
Yes.
Ms. Adams.
Yes.
Mr. Glenn.
Yes.
Ms. Townsend.
Yes.
Mr. Nixon.
Yes.
Mr. Nieper,
Yes.
and Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 26812 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 26912.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with Vance Construction, Inc. for demolition of residential structures during the 2013 calendar year.
Mr. President,
Mr.
I
Nieper.
move that ordinance number 26912 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 26912 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe,
Yes.
Mr. Tevin.
Yes.
Ms. Adams.
Yes.
Mr. Glenn.
Yes.
Ms. Townsend.
Yes.
Mr. Nixon.
Yes.
Mr. Nieper,
Yes.
and Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 26912 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 27012.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with Miller Cable Company.
Mr. President,
Mr.
I
Nieper.
move that ordinance number 270-12 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 27012 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe,
Yes.
Mr. Tevin.
Yes.
Ms. Adams.
Yes.
Mr. Glenn.
Yes.
Ms. Townsend.
Yes.
Mr. Nixon.
Yes.
Mr. Nieper,
Yes.
and Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 27012 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 27112.
Authorizing the mayor to accept a donation of real property.
Mr. President,
Mr. McLean.
I move that ordinance 27112 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 27112 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe,
Yes.
Mr. Tevin.
Yes.
Ms. Adams.
Yes.
Mr. Glenn.
Yes.
Ms. Townsend.
Yes.
Mr. Nixon.
Yes.
Mr. Nieper,
Yes.
and Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 27112 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 27212.
Authorizing the mayor to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the demolition of the structure located at 412, 416 North Union.
Mr. President,
Mr. McLean.
I move that ordinance 27212 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 27212 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe,
Yes.
Mr. Tevin.
Yes.
Ms. Adams.
Yes.
Mr. Glenn.
Yes.
Ms. Townsend.
Yes.
Mr. Nixon.
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 27212 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 27212.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with Ben's Construction for demolition at 1101 West North Street.
Mr. President,
Mr. McLean.
I move that ordinance 27312 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 27312 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk. Mr. McLean.
If I may, just for everyone's, if anyone's passed down North Street and Jameson Avenue, they see this demolition has been done already. It is the old Rose Shop, and it is down, and it sure does make a difference when you're going down that street, so, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. McLean. I also am going to point out something that we learned in this process, in an amount not to exceed $17,300. To put it in perspective, beyond the risk to life of passers-by and damages to vehicles with the way that building was bowing out, in addition to all of that, should that building have fallen on the light post that stretches across Jamison Avenue on the southbound lane, that light pole carries a cost of at least $25,000. So it is a sound economic decision that was made, and I appreciate the fact that it was taken down expeditiously. Is there any further discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 273-12 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 274-12.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with Tom All Chrysler Dodge.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn.
I move that ordinance 274-12 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 274-12 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 274-12 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 275-12.
Amending Section 234.03 of the Codified Ordinances of Lima, Ohio.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn.
I move that ordinance 275-12 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 275-12 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 275-12 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 276-12.
Amending Section 234.06 of the Codified Ordinances of Lima, Ohio.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn.
I move that ordinance 276-12 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 276-12 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 276-12 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 277-12.
Amending Section 234.07 of the Codified Ordinances of Lima, Ohio.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn.
I move that ordinance 277-12 be placed on second reading and referred to the Safety Service Committee.
Second.
The motion and the second is to place ordinance 277-12 on a second reading and refer it to Council's Safety Services Committee. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. 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 Those opposed? The motion carries. Ordinance 278-12.
Amending Section 234.181 of the Codified Ordinances of Lima, Ohio.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn.
I move that ordinance 278-12 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 278-12 on its first reading. Is there any discussion?
Mr. President,
Ms. Adams?
if I may, I'd like to ask Chief Hefner if he could step up and expand on the reasoning for this clarification or specifics on the arson investigators being allowed to carry a firearm.
Mr. President, the purpose of the amendment to this ordinance was to clarify some language that allows our arson investigator, gives him the police powers. The ordinance does authorize police powers, but nowhere does it specifically mention he has the authority to carry a firearm. After discussion with the law department and seeing what's happening in some other cities, we decided to clarify that for the safety of the city and also protect our arson investigators should they ever have to draw their weapon, use their weapon. It provides further protection for the city and also for our investigators.
And there is training that's involved, or
Correct.
which we already have.
Correct. What Ms. Adams is referring to, many cities in the state of Ohio took the firearms away from some of their investigators and some of their personnel. What they found was, through one reason or another, people were carrying weapons without the authorized training, without the training required. That's not the case in the city of Lima. All the people that we have that carry weapons are authorized and have all the specific training required.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. Is there any further discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Tevin? Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 278-12 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 279-12.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with MS Government for maintenance and software of the GEM software.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin?
I move that ordinance 279-12 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 279-12 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 279-12 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 280-12.
Amending ordinance 222-12.
Mr. President,
Mr. Glenn?
I move that ordinance 280-12 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 280-12 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 280-12 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 281-12.
Making preliminary appropriations for current and ordinary expenses of the City of Lima, Ohio for the period beginning January 1st, 2013 until the annual appropriation ordinance of the City of Lima, Ohio is in force.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin?
I move that ordinance 281-12 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 281-12 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 281-12 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 282-12.
Authorizing the transfer of cash between certain funds as herein described.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin?
I move that ordinance 282-12 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 282-12 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 282-12 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 283-12.
Authorizing cash advances from the general fund to certain other funds and for reimbursement back to the general fund.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin?
I move that ordinance 283-12 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 283-12 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 283-12 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 284-12.
Establishing a new base salary for the city auditor beginning January 1st, 2014.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin?
I move that ordinance 284-12 be placed on second reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to place ordinance 284-12 on second reading. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? The motion carries. Ordinance 285-12.
Amending the 2012 annual budget.
Mr. President,
Mr. Tevin?
I move that ordinance 285-12 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 285-12 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 285-12 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Ordinance 286-12.
Authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with Ron Elliott for plan review services for the 2013 calendar year.
Mr. President,
Mr. Nieper.
I move that ordinance number 286-12 be passed on its first reading.
Second.
The motion and the second is to pass ordinance 286-12 on its first reading. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Ms. Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes.
Ordinance 286-12 has been passed on its first reading by an 8-0 vote. Miscellaneous business, Mr. Lowe.
Thank you, Mr. President. This evening, I have to be the bearer of some bad news. Had an individual who I got to meet, who I consider a great man since I've been on council. He became a member of the East Side Neighborhood Association and was very active with us, and he lent me a great deal of advice on some things. But I'm sorry to report that Mr. Richard Hartzog, he passed this evening. He's with the city for about 30 years, and he's just a good guy. He's just a really good guy. And at this time, I would like to make a motion for Council Secretary to prepare a resolution for Mr. Hartzog.
Second.
The motion and the second is to authorize the clerk to prepare a resolution memorializing Mr. Hartzog. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries.
Okay. Also, you know, in our opening prayer this afternoon, we mentioned the Sandy Hook children, and unfortunately things happen, and since I've been on council, I have been begging for security at this front door. And if you've listened to any of the interviews of these families, they spoke on, never thought it would happen here. And at this time, I'm going to ask that the Safety Service Committee please go back and look at this, because it's been sitting for a while now. But I think we really need to get a handle on some things. It came down to finances, but if you look at the amount of money that was spent or that's going to be spent this evening, we could have had a job in there easily. So I ask that we look at that again, please. I'd like to say hello to Babb School. I see that you're out in the great numbers tonight. But we thank you for being here. And it's very important that you become involved in what your city and your county is doing. And the last thing, I'd just like to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, and personally want to thank God for sending His Son, Jesus Christ, for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lowe. Mr. Tevin.
Just two things. The opening prayer and the reference to the shooting in Newtown, Connecticut. That is one of those events that you will always remember where you were when you heard of that kind of a tragedy. The little babies that were murdered. It just makes, I mean, it just makes me want to cry. I look at the news cycle and how these things are covered. I just hope that as those families in that community, I hope they can find some peace and a way to move forward and heal. But as a country, I hope that we can have an open and honest discussion about what kind of a country we really want and are willing to provide. And have that discussion without the vitriol and the hatred and the emotion that you hear from opposing sides on the issue of gun control. The United States of America that I grew up in is better than that. And there never would be an acceptable time for an event like the tragedy that occurred, but just a few days before Christmas makes it seem even worse. I would like to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and happy and safe holidays, and we've got a lot of work ahead of us next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tevin. Ms. Adams?
Thank you, Mr. President. Midway East Neighborhood Association is going to be meeting this Thursday, the 20th, at 7 p.m. at 727 East Kibbe. I'd like to ask Mr. Caprella Didn't get an opportunity to speak to you in pre-council, but if you could give us an update on the benches program for the reservoir?
It's going to be very short.
That's fine. We've talked about this for a couple of weeks. I
That's
publicly...
why she asked for you and not Mr. Shealy.
That's right.
It's going to be short.
Because there are no benches yet, so that's why I said it's going to be very short. That's right.
That's right.
You know, I did, you know, council requested and the mayor requested that we look into benches, and we are looking, we're probably going to, we said we'd put them at Bressler, but I think for strategic purposes, we're going to put them on the new Williams Reservoir. There's a few areas there where we have a little more room, where there's some widening areas for turnaround for vehicles, so we could possibly get 3 of them on there. So sometime in January, I think we'll probably have those benches. They're not up yet, but we have looked into it, so
All right.
that's why it's short. Nothing has been done.
Thank you, sir. And then finally, as everyone will probably this evening, wish everyone a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and travel safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. Mr. Glenn?
I just got a couple things there, because my voice about gone. I'm glad you guys
We'll
are here.
understand.
You understand? We're glad to see the Bath kids here. Good job. Glad to see you guys here. I've been seeing you guys here every city council. Hoover Park Neighborhood Association had a Christmas party. I didn't get to make it, though, but he told me to make sure I let everybody know thank you for all the people who came out, the mayor, the Husky, and a lot of people in the neighborhood came out to that. Also, I want to wish everyone a Merry Christmas. And I just got a text there that we will be taking, because we was collecting bears to take down Newtown. And Kathy just texted me, said we got somebody going to be traveling down there to the kids, so I'm happy for that. And, you know, like Tom has said, this is just a touchy moment right now, you know. I know when the president got up and spoke about it, it brought tears to his eyes, and I know it brought tears to everyone else's eyes, too. So just keep the family in prayer. Also, we'll be having breakfast Santa Claus down at the Sher Island Center this Saturday. So we're looking over 500 kids going to be coming out for that. We've got a lot of volunteers will be cooking pancakes and sausage for the kids. And we'd like to appreciate Anthony Stockings, who gave us a donation there to help buy the toys for these kids. And I wish everyone a Merry Christmas. And my committees, I'll be setting up these committees up with Sally, and you guys will get them over your emails as we make these dates. But next week I'm on break, okay? So I'm gonna take a break next week, and I know everyone appreciate all the donation for the homeless shelter. I had an interesting night there, so thanks everyone for all the donation. And God bless everyone who sent the donation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Glenn. Ms. Townsend?
Thank you, Mr. President. Just to thank you, last night, Westgate Neighborhood Association had its Christmas dinner, and it was hosted by Chamberlain Huck Reedy, as it is every year, and it was a very generous and lovely time to be together with the neighbors, and it was a packed house, actually. So I want to express a lot of thanks to the Chamberlain Huck Reedy Funeral Home for sponsoring that. I don't know, I was going to ask the law director, should we add not just the number of ordinances, but the amount of time it took? Because I think this could be a record per ordinance time tonight. 26 we had tonight of the total. And I would also like to wish everybody a very Merry Christmas and safe and prosperous New Year. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Townsend. Mr. Nieper?
Nothing this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Nieper. Mr. McLean?
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a couple items. Northside Neighborhood Association is going to have their meeting tomorrow night at 7 o'clock at St. George Parish Hall. Again, that's going to be their Christmas meal, so bring a covered dish. They'll provide the meat and the other fixings to go with it. So, and also like to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and have a happy holidays. But remember your families. You know, it's not just yours, but your neighbors. There are a lot of people out there that are in need. So if you've got a couple minutes and you can do an act of kindness, do it. This is a great time of year to do that.
Thank you, Mr. McLean. I, too, want to recognize the students from Bath and embarrass one because he's my nephew, Mr. Eric Jordan. How many students are here from Bath? Why don't you guys stand up?
Wow.
we wanted to welcome you and thank you for coming, and if you do ever need any more information about your local government, feel free to come back or contact any one of us or our clerk for any other information you need, okay? I know you guys are here because of class, okay? But I think it's good, and I hope hopefully you've learned something about the process this evening, okay? Eric, sorry, buddy, for embarrassing you. Is that see? That's why he's my favorite nephew. Thanks. Going to call a special council meeting for Wednesday, December 19th at 6:30 p.m. for the purposes of considering ordinance 28412. I'm going to try to do this right without butchering it, but for many years, Councilor David Adams was on our council, and every meeting he would have a bit of poetry. I've run across one that I've probably said at previous final meetings of the year. It's just a part of a lyrics from a song from a group called the Goo Goo Dolls, pretty popular current group. They actually wrote the song in the aftermath of the hurricane in New Orleans. But as you read all of the lyrics and understand all of the lyrics, in my opinion, it's probably one of the most poignant Christmas songs that there could ever be written. And one of the stanzas is that you ask me what I want this year, and I'll try to make this kind and clear. It's just a chance that maybe we'll have better days. I don't need boxes wrapped in string, designer love, or fancy things. Just a chance that maybe we'll have better days. Merry Christmas to everyone. I hope that the new year is prosperous for all. Mr. Tevin?
Could you sing that for us?
No. I could, but my nephew would say, don't. So,
Mr. President, I move that Lima City Council adjourn into executive session to review collective bargaining matters.
Second.
the motion and the second is that Lima City Council adjourn into executive session for the purposes of discussing collective bargaining issues. Is there any discussion? I'll have the clerk call the roll.
Mr. Lowe?
Yes.
Mr. Tevin?
Yes.
Miss Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Miss Townsend?
Yes.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
Mr. Nieper.
Yes.
And Mr. McLean.
Yes. The motion passes unanimously, and Lima City Council will adjourn into executive session in 8 minutes.